committee will come to order. If everybody could please take their seats. Welcome, Speaker Pelosi, all of our task force members, panelists who are with us today, and all of our guests. We're here because the Senate refuses to act. Nearly 200 days ago, our House passed H.R. 8, the Bipartisan Background Check Act of 2019. We passed it with an overwhelming bipartisan majority. The House finally replaced thoughts and prayers with action. We stood with more than 90% of the American people who support universal background checks. Unfortunately, the Senate has failed to act. So today, we'll hear from a survivor, law enforcement, a gun owner, a mayor, and a youth leader who all stand in support of common sense gun violence prevention legislation. They know that the Senate inaction is leading to staggering numbers of people being killed and injured. There have been nearly 300 mass shootings already this year. It's so many that they aren't even getting the media coverage any longer. And that toll does not include the people who are dying in domestic shootings on the streets or in single acts of violence. More than 10,000 people have been killed already this year by someone using a gun. I have one question for Majority Leader McConnell. When is enough enough? We know background checks work. Every day they stop 170 felons and 50 domestic abusers from getting a gun from a licensed dealer. But as we saw in the recent Odessa shooting, prohibited purchasers could just go to an unlicensed seller and buy one without a background check. That's wrong. So today, we will keep up the fight and call on the Senate to act. We're tired of your thoughts and prayers. We want your votes. Now I yield to the first speaker in a generation to pass meaningful gun violence legislation, Speaker Pelosi.
Thank you very much, Mr. Thompson, for your leadership. I'm very honored to join you and our distinguished panel today for the Gun Violence Prevention Task Force. Oh, I see. Sorry. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm pleased to join you in the Gun Violence Prevention Task Force Forum on the urgent need for Senate action. This forum is distinguished by the presence of so many leaders. I join you in welcoming our distinguished panel, including survivors, student leaders, veterans, and respected representatives of our law enforcement and public health communities. Let me also give you another salute, Chairman Mike Thompson, for the outstanding leader in this fight to end gun violence epidemic. You've been on both sides of the barrel as a veteran, a decorated war hero, and as a sportsman. During the district work period, Democrats accelerated a drumbeat across America, holding weeks of town hall meetings and events to urge Senator McConnell to take up our House-passed bipartisan gun violence prevention legislation, which saves lives. Over the past 6 weeks, our nation has been in mourning for the tragic loss of life from the recent acts of gun violence, including in Gilroy, El Paso, Dayton, Chicago, and West Texas. And we have representatives here from other tragic events as well. We also know that gun violence inflicts a daily devastating toll on communities. In addition to these high-profile events, in every corner of our country, cutting short the lives of 100 people, including 47 children and teenagers, every single day. That is nearly 40,000 people killed every year, 40,000 of our brothers and sisters, our children and grandchildren, our neighbors and friends. We know what must be done. More than 90% of the American people support common sense background check legislation. Background checks work. They have blocked more than 3 million gun sales since first passed. Blocked more than 3 million gun sales since first passed. Yet new technologies have enabled efforts to circumvent the laws. Countless millions of guns are sold or transferred through unlicensed dealers today. No background checks completed, no questions asked. That is why one of the first acts of our Democratic House majority was to pass the bipartisan background check bill H.R. 8, so named because of the 8 years from when we introduced it, from the tragedy in Tucson when our former colleague, then our colleague Gabby Giffords was injured and others died. In addition, we passed the enhanced background checks, Mr. Clyburn's legislation. He can't be here today because of an illness in the family, but I do want to salute Mr. Clyburn for H.R. 1112, common sense background legislation to expand background checks in terms of the time involved. Public health officials, local leaders, and law enforcement know that our legislation would save lives. We've had many letters and testimonials to that extent. I will cite one. Last month, the president of the Major Cities Chiefs Association, representing America's police chiefs, wrote to the president and Congress urging us in these words, in no uncertain terms, to immediately act by enacting common sense legislation to reduce the scourge of everyday gun violence and the slaughter of innocent people during what feels like a never-ending mass shooting events in our schools, entertainment venues, places of worship, businesses, and homes. They go on to say, the letter goes on to say, these tragic incidents are profoundly plaguing our nation, cutting short precious human lives and tearing out the hearts and souls of countless families. The nearly 800,000 men and women in law enforcement in the United States don a badge each day placed over their heart representing their dedication and commitment to run toward danger whenever and wherever called upon to do so. The letter goes on to say, they are doing their part every day, every shift, and on every call for help. Will you do your part? They ask us. Yes, we will do our part. Yet, Senator McConnell refuses to do his part to save lives. No one's political survival is more important than the survival of our children. Thousands of people, thousands of children have died since Senator McConnell first refused to take up our bills. We will fight on every front in the courts, in the Congress, and in the court of public opinion to make sure this issue is too hot to handle for the GOP to block. We're not taking no for an answer for our bipartisan legislation. We won't stop until the job is done. Thank you all for your leadership in this fight. I welcome you, Madam Mayor. Thank you for your courage. To each of our special witnesses, we look forward to your testimony. And I yield back to our distinguished chairman, Mr. Thompson.
Thank you, Speaker. Panelists, as you know, you'll have 4 minutes for your statements. After that, I'll recognize members for 4 minutes each. And colleagues, just a reminder on your 4 minutes that will be allotted for your questions or statements and the panelists' response. We have a hard out. We have to be out of this room at 2:45. We have some outstanding panelists today. Retired Chief Daniel Isom is the former Chief of Police for the St. Louis Metropolitan Police Department in Missouri. Vic Bencomo is a 22-year Navy veteran, gun owner, and a member of the Colorado Gun Owners for Safety. The Honorable Christine Hunchowski is the mayor of Parkland, Florida. Dr. Joseph Sakrin is a gun violence survivor and a trauma surgeon from Baltimore, Maryland. And our student leader, Ms. Jackson Lee, would you like to introduce her?
Thank you very much. Just to say that Ariel Hobbs is an outstanding leader who has been impacted, Congressman, from the tragedy in Florida. And she stands for March for Our Lives. She was a powerful witness at our gun summit in Houston. We're delighted that she is taking up the challenge, even though it is painful to her. We thank her for her leadership. Ariel Hobbs, a student leader on anti-gun violence, preventing gun violence.
Thank you very much. Chief, we're going to start with you.
Thank you, Speaker Pelosi, Chairman Thompson, and members of the Gun Violence Prevention Task Force for holding this very important forum today. I've been in law enforcement for over 30 years, And sadly, this past August has been nothing short of ordinary when it comes to gun violence in America. There have been mass shootings, there have been suicides, and there have been communities that have experienced gun violence on a daily basis. More than 100 Americans are killed with guns every day. The 3 mass shootings in August shocked the consciousness of the American public. America is now demanding action from the U.S. Senate. In a single 24-hour period at the beginning of last month, gun violence tore apart communities in El Paso and Dayton. The month closed with a mass shooter driving around West Texas, indiscriminately shooting and killing 7 people and wounding 25 more. I'd like to talk a little bit about St. Louis, where I served as police chief and I currently live, because it's reflective of the importance of strong gun safety laws. A rash of recent shootings has traumatized our youth and our city. Since April of this year, gun violence has killed at least 12 children in St. Louis. All of these children were under the age of 16. One St. Louis student named Michael summed up what many of us are feeling. He said, "I feel like nowhere is safe anymore. Every American should feel safe in their communities, to run errands or enjoy the night out with friends without the fear of gun violence." I can understand why Michael feels this way. Just 2 months ago, there was a shooting outside of my house, and thankfully no one was killed or injured. One significant reason for the increase in gun violence has been rolling back critical gun safety laws. In 2007, when I was the major on the St. Louis Police Department, the gun lobby-backed legislators began the process of eviscerating Missouri's gun laws. For a decade, Missouri had required background checks for anyone seeking to buy a handgun as a part of the state's permit to purchase law. But the Missouri legislature repealed this common sense law. The results have been disastrous for public safety, according to law enforcement officers and the research. The effect of this rollback is that homicide rates have went up as high as 27% by some estimates. Firearms suicides have increased by 16%. And the repeal has had a strong association with an increase in the number of crime guns with a shorter sale-to-crime interval, a common indicator of illegal gun diversion. Missouri is an example of what happens when elected officials refuse to stand up to common sense, life-saving gun laws. It makes our communities less safe, and it makes the work for law enforcement less safe as more guns flood into our streets. This is why Americans of every political stripe are looking to Congress to take action to address this epidemic of gun violence in our nation. There is broad consensus on legislative solutions that will save lives, including requiring background checks on all gun sales and temporarily removing access to guns for people in crisis. The House has already passed bipartisan legislation to require background checks on all gun sales. This type of legislation is urgently needed to close loopholes that allow prohibited purchasers, such as domestic abusers and convicted felons, to purchase guns from strangers they meet online or at gun shows. I'd like to spend a moment to talk about the online loophole because it didn't exist when background check laws were passed in 1993. One website, armslist.com, claims it is the largest online market for guns. According to an investigation by Everytown for Gun Safety, there were more than 1.2 million ads for gun sales on armslist.com that did not require a background check in 2018 alone. These ads were posted by unlicensed sellers offering guns for sale in states that do not require background checks on unlicensed sales. In Missouri, there were 54,195 ads for firearms where no background checks were required in 2018. Criminals know they can exploit the internet to get armed, as the investigation found
Okay,
that
Chief,
more...
we're going to have to wrap that up, but we get the idea. Thank you.
Right.
Thank you very much. All right. Mr. Bencomo.
Good afternoon, Speaker Pelosi, Chairman Thomas, and members of the Gun Violence Prevention Task Force. My name is Vic Bencomo. I'm a father, a gun owner, a hunter, and a proud Denver resident for over 30 years. I'm also a combat veteran. I served over 20 years in the United States Navy. I like to think I understand what it means to be a patriot. I supported and defended the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. Unfortunately, America currently faces a different kind of threat. Each year, 36,000 Americans die in gun violence, and over 100,000 are shot and injured. I've seen violence. In Iraq, we understood that serving our country came with an inherent risk. We put our lives on the line knowing that we may never come home. But that is not a risk that should extend to our neighbors, our children, and our places of worship. Sometimes it feels like there's no end in sight. Columbine, Aurora, El Paso, Dayton, Odessa, Midland, the list keeps growing. And every day across the country, the daily threat of gun violence in countless communities has become a shocking reality. My life and those of my children are in greater danger here at home than it was in an active combat zone. I mentioned that I'm a gun owner. I have a concealed carry's license. I enjoy deer and pheasant hunting. I have voted for both Democrats and Republicans. But I also know that my Second Amendment rights do not preclude me from supporting common sense gun safety measures. That's why I recently joined Colorado Gun Owners for Safety, a group of hunters, sports shooters, concealed carriers, and collectors who support reasonable gun ownership and common sense gun laws. We proudly support the Second Amendment. We also recognize that our country is in the midst of a crisis, and we have to be part of the solution. Like many across the country, we have turned to Congress to take action, yet our words have fallen on deaf ears in the United States Senate. More than 6 months ago, the House of Representatives took the monumental steps of passing universal background checks and legislation to address the Charleston loophole. They did so in a bipartisan fashion, and yet these bills, H.R. 8, H.R. 1112, sit in the Senate without so much of a hearing. And since that day, 15,000 Americans have died from gun violence. Enough is enough. It's time the Senate gets back to work and pass life-saving legislation. This is personal for me. As a veteran, I'm witnessing my fellow servicemen take their lives at a catastrophic rate, with the majority of them being from firearms. 20 veterans commit suicide daily nationwide. That's over 6,000. 6,000 of our veterans are committing suicide. We're losing more a year than we have lost in both of the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq over the last 18 years. More than once, my phone has rang, and on the other end is a veteran asking for help, asking me to hold on to their firearm because they don't know where else to turn. It doesn't have to be this way. However, progress is happening in states all across the country. Colorado, for example, has taken steps like establishing universal background checks, large capacity magazine bans, and extreme risk protection in order to keep guns out of the hands of those in crisis. But life-saving progress does not seem to be happening here in Washington. What we're asking for isn't hard, but it does take courage. As a veteran, a father, and a gun owner, I had to dig deep for the courage many times in my life. I hope the United States Senators find the courage as well. So to close, I have one message for the Senate. Do your job. Americans are dying. Thank you, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you very much. Mayor Hunchowski.
Chairman Thompson, Speaker Pelosi, my Congressman Ted Deutsch, and the Gun Violence Prevention Task Force, thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to address you today. My name is Christine Hunchowski, and I am the proud mayor of the wonderful city of Parkland, Florida. On Wednesday, February 14th, 2018, our community suffered a horrific mass shooting at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School, leaving 17 people dead, 17 others injured, and untold numbers grieving and suffering throughout our community. They were students, teachers, and coaches. Since that time, family and community members impacted by this tragedy have advocated for policy changes to help prevent future gun violence. There are no easy answers. We must act comprehensively, which does include access to better mental health care, social emotional learning in schools, economic opportunities, and making sure that those who wish to do harm to themselves or others do not have access to a firearm. No single solution will stop all gun violence, but every measure that can help prevent gun violence should be and must be considered. After the shooting at our high school, Florida rapidly enacted a risk protection order law, also known as a red flag law. The Florida RPO law provides law enforcement the ability to petition a court to order an individual who is a danger to themselves or to others to surrender firearms in their possession immediately and prohibit the possession and purchase of a firearm for 1 year. Florida's RPO law provides due process to the individual, including a right to contest in a full hearing. Prior to the expiration of the RPO, the prohibitions can be extended after another full hearing. Until Florida passed the RPO law, when law enforcement did not have a basis to arrest someone or utilize our mental health temporary commitment law, but knew a person was communicating violent threats and was in crisis, there was no tool to allow law enforcement to seize the firearms or prohibit the purchase. Law enforcement will tell you today that they are happy that they have RPOs, and in fact, in Broward County, there have been over 300 RPOs since the enactment of the law. With nearly 18 months' experience in knowing the circumstances under which people have been subjected to an RPO after full hearing, we think to ourselves, what could have been done in our community? What could have been prevented if this had been a tool? And while RPOs are wonderful, there is a glaring and dangerous loophole. Florida only requires mandatory background checks for the purchase of a firearm when an individual attempts to purchase it from a licensed gun seller. There is no requirement whatsoever for a background check involving a purchase from a private seller. As a result, an RPO can be entered into, and the person can then go right to a private sale because the seller would have no way of knowing the RPO's existence. The danger to our community is real. A 2017 study estimated that 22% of U.S. gun owners acquired their most recent firearm without a background check. Private legal sales are conducted every day in our country through legal online advertising, gun shows, and person-to-person sales. As a result, RPOs are most effective if we have enhanced background checks for all firearm purchases. This is nothing more than requiring the exact same background checks from purchases from a licensed dealer that they get performed in the case of a private sale. It's literally that simple. However, this hasn't been taken up in the Senate yet. In the meantime, our communities are at risk for those who everyone agrees should not have possession of a firearm. Background checks will not stop every act of violence, just as seatbelts and airbags do not prevent every death or injury. Those who are determined to buy a firearm can still do so through the illegal underground market, but why would we make it easier rather than harder for someone who everyone agrees should not be even able to possess a firearm to go out and buy a firearm? Why would we not implement common sense safety measures like seatbelts and airbags to reduce risks? Democracy is government of the people, by the people, and for the people. When a bipartisan majority of the people want background checks and logic tells us this common sense firearm safety measure is needed, why wouldn't this happen? This is time for statesmanship and not partisanship.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Dr. Saccharin.
Thank you, Chairman Thompson, Madam Speaker, committee members, for the opportunity to be here, not just as someone that is a trauma surgeon that's taking care of hundreds of victims of gun violence, but also as a survivor of gun violence. And that gives me a unique vantage point having seen both sides. You know, healthcare professionals like myself are the ones that are on the front line taking care of these patients day in and day out. We're the ones that are trying to stop the bleeding from pulverized tissue and torn flesh. We're the ones that have to go into those waiting rooms and tell those families that their loved one is never coming home again. And we're also the ones that understand that the best medical treatment is prevention. Now look, I understand this is an emotionally charged issue, as it is when we discuss anything regarding rights, freedoms, and the death of our children in schools all across this country. But the truth of the matter is as Americans, we have a lot more in common than we have that divides us. And in the mainstream media, this issue seems polarized, but frankly, I have a hard time thinking of another issue where over 90% of Americans agree that we should have comprehensive background checks. Americans are saying that we need to do better, and we can do better. Make no mistake about this, this is a public health crisis that we are facing. In the next decade, over 1 million Americans will be shot. And that doesn't even begin to capture a small amount of the picture. The mothers, the fathers, the sisters, and the brothers that are affected, the families that are destroyed, leaving tens of millions devastated. These are not just numbers and statistics. These are human lives. These are members of our community. These are families that form the bedrock and foundation of this nation that is being destroyed by every senseless tragedy that happens. Our background check system is inadequate. And it's been nearly 200 days, as the chairman said, since the House has passed both H.R. 8 and H.R. 1112. Yet, the Senate still refuses to act. And that inaction comes with consequences, with members of our military community that are coming home and surviving the battlefield only to be killed on the streets of America, with perpetrators like the one we saw in Odessa, where they failed a background check only to purchase it from a private setting, and from online sellers like Arms List, which I went to this morning, and I could easily purchase countless numbers of assault rifles without having to undergo a background check. Look, there's no one solution to this problem. If anyone believes that, they clearly lack an understanding of how complex a health problem this is. But passing comprehensive background check is the foundation. You know, the worst part of my job is having to walk into those waiting rooms and look at those parents, some of which we have here behind us today, and tell them that their child is never coming home. There's no more smiles, no more birthdays, and they come home to a house full of shoes, backpacks, and simply nothing but the memory of their child. That is not the America we want to live in. The Senate has both the opportunity and the responsibility to act. It is time to take action, not sides. This is not a Democratic problem. It's not a Republican problem. It's a uniquely American problem, and it's uniquely in your hands to actually move this legislation forward.
Thank you, Doctor. Ms. Hobbs, you're recognized for 4 minutes.
Good afternoon. My name is Ariel Hobbs, and I'm happy to be here today representing March for Our Lives, a nationwide youth advocacy movement that grew out of the tragic mass killing at Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida. At the same time that my friends and colleagues in Parkland were organizing the March for Our Lives here in D.C., thousands of students around the country planned over 800 sibling marches. I was one of those students who, along with my friends, planned a march in Houston, Texas. As a Texan, I have watched in profound sadness over the last month as 2 mass shootings rocked my home state, in addition to the daily gun violence that plagues communities like Houston. Every year, nearly 40,000 people die due to gun violence. Nearly every day, there's another mass shooting. People aren't safe living their lives. I don't believe this is the America that anyone wants, but this is the America that we live in today. Speaker Pelosi, Representative Thompson, and all the members of this task force, I want to offer my thanks and gratitude for standing up and saying that enough is enough. America needs a national plan to comprehensively address our nation's gun violence epidemic. That is why a few weeks ago we released a plan for a safer America, a bold and comprehensive solution to end gun violence in America. In the first few months of this session of Congress, the House passed legislation critical to saving lives. H.R. 8, the Bipartisan Background Checks Act, and H.R. 1112, the Enhanced Background Checks Act. This was a clear sign of the priority that this body places on achieving peace and safety. As you know, H.R. 8 would expand federal background checks for gun purchases to include all sales, closing loopholes that would allow private sales of guns without a background check, including those purchased on the internet or at gun shows. According to a 2017 study published in the Annals of Internal Medicine, private gun sales represent 22% of all gun sales in the U.S. Worse, according to a 2013 study, 80% of firearms acquired for use in criminal activity were purchased this way. We must close this loophole. H.R. 1112 would close what is tragically known as the Charleston loophole, which allows gun sales if a background check has not been completed within 3 days. It was this loophole that allowed the Charleston shooter to purchase the gun he used to kill 9 people at Mother Emanuel AME Church. 4 years have passed since then, and nothing has been done. We are here today to ask, when will enough be enough? When will the government act to protect us? This House has taken the critical first steps, but it is now time for Senator McConnell to step up and put the safety and well-being of the American people first. We must change Americans' gun culture if we are to end this crisis. We won't stop fighting until people are made more important than the guns that kill them. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We're now going to go to the members' questions, and I'm going to forego questions on my part so we get a chance to get to as many people as possible. We'll start with Ms. McBath.
Thank you, Chairman Thompson. Thank you, Speaker Pelosi, and all the Gun Violence Prevention Task Force members that are here today, and those of you that are victims and survivors and interested parties. I cannot thank you enough for your attendance today. Thank you for participating in this forum, especially those of you that are before us today. You know, week after week and day after day, Americans of every color from every community are being murdered while they're just going about their daily lives. And we were elected here to work for the American people. The House has passed a bill requiring universal background checks. We have passed a bill to close the Charleston loophole, and we have passed legislation that's dedicated to funding the study of gun violence. We have acted to save lives because inaction is completely unacceptable. But it's past time that the Senate does the work we need them to do to save American lives. Today, the House Judiciary Committee, which many of the members of our Gun Violence Prevention Task Force will be in session. We are holding a historic markup to limit large capacity magazines, to limit access to guns for those convicted of hate crimes, and to give families and law enforcement more tools to prevent gun violence. Those life-saving tools are extreme risk protection orders, including my bill, the Federal Extreme Risk Protection Order Act of 2019, and these tools will help prevent gun violence, including mass shootings, suicides, and all the horrific events that do not make the headlines every single day. Too often we are told that we must accept these tragedies. We're told that instead of changing our lives, we must have more lockdown drills, more security guards, and more bulletproof glass, more vigils for those that we have lost. But we also see time and time again that someone knew that a shooter was dangerous. Someone knew that the shooter had weapons. Someone knew that the shooter was filled with violent thoughts, or even that a person was thinking of taking his or her own life. Too often, someone knew, but no one had a tool to do anything about it. Extreme risk protection orders provide the tools to step in and to stop the violence. Nearly 100 people in this country every single day, each and every day, they continue to die as a result of gun violence, and my son Jordan was one of them. 100 Americans every single day are dying. 100 families, 100 communities, 100 people. It is our responsibility to prevent this suffering, to bring an end to this constant heartbreak. For every single day we fail to take action, mothers and fathers across the country will live through the same nightmare that I did, that so many victims and survivors have. For every single day that we fail to take action, siblings and spouses will feel the same agony, the same grief that comes with losing a loved one. Inaction is simply unacceptable. So today, the House chooses to act to help those in crisis. We act to empower law enforcement. We act to prevent the vigil for the loved ones that we have lost. Because I know the pain of losing a child to gun violence, and no one should ever have to face that pain.
Thank you. Mr. Perlmutter, you're recognized for 4 minutes.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Dr. Safran, your testimony was very powerful, and you know, I come from an area where Mr. Bencomo is, the Denver area. We've had Aurora, mass shooting, we've had Columbine, we've had some other tragedies, and the effect on the medical staff dealing with the trauma from something like that, the effect on the family and the trauma that just sort of rips through a community is something that I could hear in your voice and heard in your testimony and from all of our panelists, because it's a scar that we all have to contend with for a long time. And I just appreciate the testimony. Mr. Bencomo, I wanted to talk to you about background checks and the protective orders, the risk protective orders. Do you think in the veteran community that there is support for background checks and protective orders?
Thank you, Congressman. Absolutely. I truly believe that there is a place for background checks and ERPOs. Though there may be some varying opinions on how it should be handled and how it should be rolled out, overall, yes.
Do you think, let's focus on protective orders for a second. Do you think that temporarily removing guns from people who are at risk to themselves or others is an effective way to reduce the risk of veteran suicide?
Absolutely. Washington hasn't taken the time to do that, but I personally have taken weapons from service members to prevent suicides, and I believe I have saved lives.
I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Swalwell. You're recognized for 4 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Speaker Pelosi, for convening us, and thank you to the panelists. I want to especially thank Ms. Hobbs, to you, and the students across America who have given us the best shot in a generation to save more lives. Because you marched, because you went to town halls, because you converged with the moms and the Brady group and the Giffords group and Everytown and Newtown and all the groups out there, 17 NRA-endorsed members of Congress are not here today. They lost. And I thank you because when I drop my 2-year-old off at preschool, I think about things that my parents didn't have to think about when they drop me off. When parents get calls today, they don't fear that their kid's in trouble. They fear that something has happened. And part of your peace plan addresses the 6-point peace plan, not just an assault weapons ban, but also a buyback, seeking to reduce 30% of the firearms in America. I think that's important because banning assault weapons in the future would leave 15 million in our communities today, and that would take decades to get them out of circulation. So can you talk to why you believe a buyback, which is also endorsed by the majority of the presidential candidates who will be on stage on Thursday, why is that important?
Thank you for acknowledging me, Congressman, and thank you for acknowledging the work that me and my colleagues have done with the march. Myself and March, we believe that a buyback is important because it simply isn't enough just to say, like, okay, we're gonna have background checks, we're gonna do all these preventative measures for people that are in the process of getting guns. It's taking these guns, these harmful guns like AR-15, semi-automatic weapons, off of our streets and out of our communities, because as long as they are in the community, there's a risk that that gun will be used. I mean, that it just kind of is what it is. And so we need those removed out of our streets, out of our communities, and just out of our households, because that just lowers the risk of a potential shooting. Doesn't even have to be a mass shooting, but just another potential shooting and someone losing their life due to that gun.
Thank you, Ms. Hobbs.
Thank you.
Chief, I watched with horror 2 weeks ago video footage of a California Highway Patrol officer in Riverside County just gunned down. It was a traffic stop, and the driver who was stopped got out of his car with an assault rifle and shot at 3 officers, fatally killing one, and is a brother to 2 police officers. I tell my brothers every day, I'm afraid that with the proliferation of assault weapons in America, that you're outgunned on the streets. And I just wanted to see if you could tell us if there is support across America by chiefs and rank-and-file officers to ban assault weapons.
I think there's a lot of support across the nation from chiefs and rank-and-file officers to have common sense gun legislation. I believe that police officers around the country are fearful for the community, for themselves. They're frustrated, the community is frustrated, and they feel helpless because streets are being flooded with weapons. When you talk to officers in the city of St. Louis, they believe that everyone is potentially carrying a gun today. That creates a very tense and stressful situation throughout the community, and it puts both citizens and officers' lives at risk. And so background checks can stem the flood of those guns into the community and make the community safer and officers' jobs safer. And then I'd also say that, you know, officers are called to communities and homes when people are in crisis all the time, and people are looking for officers to help them through that crisis. And red flag laws would be a tool where officers could help to avert some of these tragedies. We don't know what people are going through, but oftentimes they do call the police to take action. And so I think you'll get broad support from police officers, and especially the rank and file who are
Thank you, Chief.
dealing with these dangerous
Thank
situations.
you. Dr. Chu.
I'd like to address this question to Dr. Joseph Sakrin. The shooter in Odessa, Texas, obtained an assault weapon, an AR-15, through a private sale. This would not have happened if our universal background check bill was signed into law, because he had failed a background check. He then went on a 20-mile rampage, killing 7 people and injuring 25, including a 17-month-old girl named Anderson Davis. He shot her directly in the face. Her injuries included shrapnel in her chest, a hole through her bottom lip, and damage to her front teeth. Her survival is nothing short of a miracle, but I can't imagine what it would be like for her to grow up having experienced this. So Dr. Sakrin, between 1994 and 2004, there was a ban on assault weapons, and a study recently found that during that 10-year period, mass shooting fatalities were 70% less likely to occur. Now, the House and Senate both have bills that would reinstate the assault weapons ban. So, Dr. Saccharin, as a surgeon, can you speak to the difference between the severity of damage that an assault weapon can cause on a human body compared to a regular handgun? Can you describe what you see in the trauma center and what it takes for a gun victim to recover?
Yeah, thank you, Congresswoman, for that question. You know, when we're seeing these patients come into our trauma center, this is really, you know, the end stage, right? Because we should be preventing these from happening. And there is a clear difference when we are seeing victims that are shot with an assault rifle. Because it doesn't just, the missile doesn't just injure the actual tissue it's going through, but it pulverizes the surrounding tissue. And that makes it more difficult for us as a team and as a group of healthcare professionals to save those lives. So it is clear that the damage is much more significant.
And can you describe what it takes for that victim to recover?
Well, it really depends on the type of injuries that these patients have. You know, you're talking about the 17-month-old that was shot in the face. I suspect that that is, you know, an absolutely devastating injury that she's going to have, you know, issues with all throughout her life. The reality is that, you know, we see the full spectrum of patients. And it's not just the patients that are dying, it's those non-fatal injuries where sometimes people end up on ventilators for life, or they have critical care needs that extend for a prolonged period of time, not to mention the mental health effects that they have after they've been injured. So the sequela really comes in a variety of manifestations.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. Dr. Ruiz.
Thank you, Congressman Thompson. I'm honored to be here to discuss a pressing public health issue our country is facing, gun violence. And I want to thank everybody for being here today, including and especially you, Ms. Hobbs, for your courage to be here. As an emergency physician and public health expert, I am heartened to see a fellow physician and public health expert on our panel today. Dr. Saccharin, thank you for sharing your moving story. I think we can both agree that the only thing worse than a death is a death that could have been prevented. Emergency physicians and trauma surgeons, I'm an emergency physician, and trauma surgeons have a lot in common. We are the two types of doctors on the front lines of treating victims of firearm violence. We're the ones who see what happens when bullets tear through the human body. We're the ones who get blood on our scrubs as we try to save their lives. And we're the ones who deliver the news to families when their loved ones don't survive. Being on the front lines means that doctors are the experts on the consequences of firearm violence, and all too often we see the pain that this epidemic inflicts on our patients, their families, and their communities. We see what an epidemic looks like from the ground level, and so many people talk about firearm violence and statistics, but my experiences are more than statistics. I remember my patients. We talk about taking a public health approach. A public health approach means looking at the scenarios of death and injury from gun violence, studying those scenarios, identifying the risks that can lead to gun violence deaths, and then implementing interventions to those risks in order to reduce the risks and reduce overall incidence of gun violence deaths. So, in terms of research, how would increased funding for firearm violence research change how you practice medicine? And what sort of data would be most helpful for you to be able to analyze?
Well, thank you very much for that question, and it's great to see a fellow physician that's now an elected member of Congress. You know, one of the things that we haven't done with this public health problem is approach it the way we've approached other public health problems that we have faced in this country. The mayor alluded to it about the car fatalities. You know, in the 60s and 70s, we didn't get rid of cars. We came up with seatbelts and airbags, and we made roads safer. And guess what? That resulted in a reduction in fatalities. So the focus...
So what kind of research would you like to see?
Well, we need a variety of research that focuses on aspects like looking at the etiology of the cause, looking at the different aspects of injury, because those treatments and those interventions are going to be different, whether you're talking about the suicides that happen Or you're talking about in cities like mine in Baltimore, where we are facing, young men of color that are being killed on a daily basis.
I have about 1 minute left. I wanted to also get your insights with your research revealing a potential link between mental health and firearm violence. I think there's too much emphasis and double speak when people put too much emphasis on mental health, but then cut Medicaid and want to reduce Medicaid, which would hurt those who rely on Medicaid, but not all these are due to mental health illnesses. Can you elucidate what your research identifies?
Yeah, so when you look at these violent crimes, we know that less than 5% of individuals that commit a violent crime are actually, have some sort of mental health diagnosis like bipolar disease, major depression, et cetera. In fact, people with mental illness are more likely to be victims. And so I think that we have to really be very careful about how we talk about this. Now, we know that there is a correlation between mental health disease and suicide, and we know that suicide is a significant problem in this overall epidemic.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Malinowski, you're recognized for 4 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wanted to start by sharing our experience in the state of New Jersey. We have in New Jersey one of the lowest rates of gun fatalities in the country. I think we're number 6 out of 50, and it's interesting to think about why that is. We are the most densely populated state in America. We have crime, we have mental illness, we have poverty just like any other state. The difference, the only discernible difference that can explain why we have such a low rate of fatalities, we have strong background checks, gun licensing laws, a ban on assault rifles, high-capacity magazines, the full range of laws that we are considering here that are blocked in the United States Senate. In fact, the only real remaining problem we have as regards gun violence and guns is that we happen to be right next door to some states that have much weaker laws. And I wanted to ask you about that aspect in particular, Chief Isom. From a law enforcement point of view, can you have effective state and local gun violence prevention laws if we have this patchwork of inconsistent laws around the country and no national standard?
Well, this argument comes up all the time when you speak of communities or states that have stronger gun laws. But if they're surrounded by states with weaker laws, then the market draws in those guns into their community. And so what many communities see when they do background checks or traces on all weapons that are seized, they find that these weapons are coming in from states with weaker laws. And so the patchwork makes it less safe for people in communities who make the decision that they want to stop the flow of illegal guns into their community.
Thank you, and that makes logical sense. I also wanted, just to shift the subject a little bit, just ask you, as a law enforcement officer, your department had to deal with potential mass shooters. What are the additional challenges law enforcement faces when you're called to a potential mass shooting situation, knowing that the shooter might have an AR-type rifle, a rifle with a high-capacity magazines? As a practical matter, what are the additional challenges you face?
Well, as a practical matter, you need to arm all of your line officers with the same type of weapons and gear that a SWAT team would enter in with it. And so that creates a huge challenge. And then we're also asking officers to enter quickly and without the resources behind them. And so it puts officers at extreme risk, and they should go in to protect individuals and save lives. But because of the high-capacity weapons that individuals have, it puts both citizens and officers at risk, line officers who don't have the SWAT training and the equipment, but they must enter to save lives. And so it makes the totality of the situation dangerous for everyone.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you very much. Mr. Moulton, you're recognized for 4 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for your leadership of this task force with the credibility of a Vietnam veteran. It means a lot. I'm a Marine veteran myself. I've used guns guns have saved my life. But I also know, because I've seen the effects of gun violence firsthand, that weapons of war have no place on our streets or in our schools. I not only use guns, I use grenades. Grenades are a great example of a weapon of war that we have made a decision as a community, as a country, to outlaw here at home. And you don't hear Republicans going around saying that because we've outlawed grenades, it violates their Second Amendment rights. You could say the same for rocket launchers and landmines and a whole bunch of other stuff. Frankly, if you need an AR-15 to shoot a deer, you need a hunting lesson. It's ridiculous to have these weapons in our communities. Now, one part of my Marine training was to go and spend some time in an emergency room. It was actually statistically the worst in the country at the time. To understand what it looks like when someone gets shot. Dr. Sakharine, I'm going to ask you to do something difficult. But I'd like you to share with us what that looks like. How does a 16-year-old girl who gets shot in the chest die from a gunshot wound? Too often we talk about these things from a clinical distance. I want to hear the clinical realities of what that looks like.
Well, thank you, Congressman. You know, having been a victim and survivor of gun violence, this is always very personal to me. And, you know, when we are getting these patients coming into our trauma center, I literally put all of my emotions and all of my thoughts aside because my goal is to perform one life-saving decision after the other to save that life. And we have at Hopkins an incredible multidisciplinary team, as we do in many of our trauma centers across this country. This is really a team effort. And these patients, like a 16-year-old girl that you're describing that's shot in the chest, the primary cause of death in these patients is because they've lost so much blood and they've bled to death. And the reality is that as good as we think we are...
Dr. Sakharine, I'm going to interrupt,
yeah,
but
please.
How does that feel to bleed to death?
Well, it feels horrible. I mean, can you imagine, just for a second, having to actually open a young girl's chest, have her heart in your hand, and there's nothing there, it's empty. She's lost all her blood volume. And then have to go out and talk to her parents and tell them that there was nothing that we could do. Well, the reality is there is something we can do, and that's prevent it from ever happening.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. McConnell. You're recognized for 4 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for your continued leadership all these years on this issue. As you can see, with almost 25% of the House caucus, Democratic caucus here, this is an issue that has really touched many people in Congress, at least on the Democratic side. Unfortunately, it doesn't really matter, it seems, what the country thinks. We've got an audience of one. Mitch McConnell is the only person who matters in terms of the power to do anything. And so my question for each of you, each of the panelists who have taken the time to come here is, if you had 30 seconds, what would you tell Mitch McConnell? Because really, this is an exercise in trying to convince him. Ms. Hobbs?
30 seconds, I would tell him 2 things. In Texas, suicide is the leading cause of death for teenagers. Most of those are due to a firearm. And 40,000 people die every year to gun violence. Do you not care about these people, or do you not, because it's clear he doesn't care, so do you not care about the lives being lost? Are those indisposable to you, or do you just care about the NRA more?
Dr. Sakharine?
Yeah, thank you. Well, I think the senator probably understands what the issue is and how to fix it, but I would simply reemphasize the fact that, bullets do not discriminate. They don't, look for Republicans, Democrats, black or white, gay or straight, right? They are killing people all across this country. And I think that our elected officials have the responsibility to implement something that the majority of Americans agree upon. So that's what I would tell them.
Madam Mayor?
So as a mayor, these things are personal for us. Behind me is my friend, Fred Guttenberg, whose daughter Jamie was killed. These are not just random people who are affected. These are our friends and our neighbors. We all don't want people who are a threat to themselves or others to get their hands on a firearm. We all agree on that. And the only way to ensure that happens is if the ones who have an RPO also have to go through a background check. I have yet to speak to any person I know, gun owner, non-gun owner, who doesn't understand that. And at some point, we were elected to represent the people. At some point, we need to show leadership and listen to those who put us in office and do everything we can to keep them safe.
Mr. Bencomo?
Thank you, Congressman. I'm not a very polished speaker, and so I would probably have some very choice words of encouragement for the senator to make some additions. I would remind him that when his time comes, he'll want to be speaking to St. Peter and not to Lucifer. So I would invite him to my great state of Colorado and have him meet some of the folks, some of the survivors that have gone through this, and let him have a heart-to-heart conversation with him. I think the people, he knows, but I think the people would love to have an opportunity to speak to all of our senators on the right. Thank you.
Chief?
I would tell the senator, if he had an opportunity to save his family member's life by passing a bill, would he do it? And many survivors and communities are asking him to do the same to save lives.
Thank you very much. Ms. Sherrill.
Thank you. I am well acquainted with firearms. In fact, my father is a hunter, and I first learned to shoot on hunting rifles. I'm also a veteran, and while serving in the Navy, I qualified as an expert on the Colt 45, the 9mm Beretta, and an M16. So I know the purpose of a gun that can fire hundreds of rounds in minutes. It's not for hunting or for civilian self-defense, it's for warfare. I'm here with my friend Jason Crow of Colorado. Jason's a former Army Ranger, and he knows, as well as I do, as well as Mr. Bencomo does, that assault weapons are weapons of war. Representative Crow and I recently wrote an op-ed together calling for a new assault weapons ban, and we both want to see a limit on high-capacity magazines. We also both want to protect our children and children across this country. I'm also proud, like Mr. Malinowski, to represent the great state of New Jersey, and our state is taking concrete actions to address the gun violence epidemic in this country. We've passed red flag laws, an assault weapons ban, and high-capacity magazine limits. According to the CDC, the firearm death rate in New Jersey in 2017 was less than half the national average. But in 2018, the New Jersey State Police and the ATF found that in spite of these steps, 77% of the firearms used in crimes in New Jersey came from out of state. So I'd like to ask each of you, going down the table, knowing how desperately we need federal action, in one sense, what is the first thing you would do to address the national gun violence epidemic? And I'd like to start with you, Chief.
I think the first thing would be to pass background checks on all gun sales. I mean, that's something that most citizens support, and it would really stop the flow of guns into our communities and give officers the tools of addressing the point of sale to the flow to other people in the community. Without that, it makes it much more challenging for law enforcement.
Thank you. Mr. Bencomo?
On a nearly everyday basis, I call Senator Cory Gardner and leave a very nice, long dissertation to him on what we would need to do in America. And I hope that I can get the phone number of Senator Mitch McConnell, and I'll be more than happy to do the same.
Thank you.
Risk protection orders and the comprehensive background checks. Everybody who has a risk protection order, they are no good without making sure that even the private sales are captured under the background checks.
Thanks so much, Mayor.
Thank you for your service. You know, I think, like I was alluding to earlier, there's no one solution. This requires really a multifaceted approach, and I think the foundation is background checks, but then also, you know, adding in licensing, looking at extreme risk protection orders, federal funding of research. It really is going to require this approach in order to reduce firearm-related injury and death in America.
Thank you so much.
I would encourage people to read our peace plan that we just put out a few weeks ago, because we need a comprehensive plan to solve this epidemic in this country. The peace plan covers from youth empowerment to buyback to implementing background checks and things of that nature. So I would just encourage people to go and read our peace plan, because we need change. Like, things have to change. So.
Thank you. And thank you all so much for coming here today. I appreciate it. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Crow.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to all of you for your courage and your leadership on this issue today. As a fellow Coloradan, I'd like to direct my question to Mr. Bencomo. Thank you for everything you've done in Colorado and our community to lead on this issue and lending the important voice of veterans to this conversation. As you alluded to earlier, in Colorado, we have led on this issue, and we passed universal background checks. And in the time that we've had those background checks on the books, over 2,000 illegal sales have been prevented in our community. And nobody's ever going to convince me that that doesn't make our community safer. You are part of and lead a group called Colorado Gun Owners for Safety. And in the time those background checks have been on the books, have you or any of the members of your organization had any tangible infringement on your rights? Because I am not aware of any, and frankly, I think we are often led to believe that there's a false choice in America between respecting the Second Amendment and the rights of law-abiding citizens and doing common sense things to end violence in our community.
No. So the reality of that statement is that the NRA and the lobbyists have bastardized the true meaning of what the Second Amendment really is. There is not an infringement on our rights. And I implore each congressperson here today to start to change the narrative. If we can't change legislation, by God, go out there and at least tell the American people what the Second Amendment really is, and that sensible gun laws are needed. Thank you.
Thank you. And you know, you spoke earlier about the impact of your service on this issue, and that you view this through the lens of a combat veteran. And as my friend Ms. Sherrill and my fellow veteran Ms. Luria, who's in attendance here today, have often spoke about this issue and others, that citizenship comes with duties and responsibilities. And I'd like for you to touch on very briefly how your background as a veteran and somebody who has taken oaths to defend the Constitution of this country and your sense of duty has informed your leadership and your approach to this issue.
Thank you. Over 20 years ago, I took an oath to serve this country and be a patriot for it, and that doesn't end when I retired. I had to continue to fight the fight, and I see that our country is in a crisis. And while we fought overseas, I'm fighting back at home. Every veteran here knows that these weapon systems takes years to learn. We have to get certified. We have to understand this weapon, because this weapon is used to kill other humans. They're not needed on our streets. Thank you.
Thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Ms. Underwood, you're recognized for 4 minutes.
Good afternoon, and thank you for allowing me to take part in this important discussion. As my colleagues before me have said, we are here today to call attention to the House-passed gun violence legislation, which the Senate has failed to even hold a legislative hearing or debate on, despite the recent shootings in El Paso, in Dayton, and in Odessa. Like too many others, my community has been impacted by gun violence. Aurora, Illinois is still grieving the lives lost in a senseless workplace shooting this February, occurring just one day after the 11-year anniversary of the shooting at Northern Illinois University. It was on February 15, 2019, that a disgruntled employee who was not legally permitted to own a firearm claimed the lives of 5 people: Trevor Weiner, age 21, Clayton Parks, age 32, Russell Byer, age 47, Vicente Juarez, age 54, and Josh Pinkard, age 37. We should all be free to work, to pray, to study, and live our lives without fear of gun violence. Universal background checks are sensible. They are bipartisan, and they would make our communities safer. We need to get it done, and there is no excuse. So I stand with you all here today to call on the Senate to bring these bills to a vote and send them to the President's desk. We can't wait. We cannot wait for another Henry Pratt or NIU shooting. Enough is enough. I'm so grateful for the expertise and the willingness of each of our panelists to share their perspectives on the way that gun violence has touched each of your lives. And I would like to ask you that in addition to supporting and passing gun violence prevention legislation, what more can we as members of Congress do to support communities like yours and mine who have had to experience these horrible tragedies? And I'd like to start with the mayor, if I would.
Thank you very much, and thank you for bringing attention to the communities that have suffered these tragedies and that are continually in the process of trying to move forward and recover. The trauma is real. There are students in our community who never went back to school. There are so many different triggers that they now have that they didn't have before, and there is a lot of mental health support that is needed after a trauma. I don't think people understand, who haven't been through it, how communities are changed, how young people who've experienced trauma are forever changed. They bring that with them for the rest of their lives, and that impacts their learning, that impacts their ability to work later. Gun violence is very expensive. And I think the more that can be done for communities afterward to support them with trauma therapy and mental health support, the better.
And in your experience, did your community struggle to access those resources?
The hard thing is, our community, there were over 400 students in that building, or approximately 400 students in that building, and teachers who had to step over dead bodies in order to get out, who saw their classmates and students and colleagues be killed. That is a different level of trauma than a lot of people have experienced working with. So it's very important that you bring in the trainers who can add trauma capacity, trauma recovery capacity to the communities. It's very important to never forget our first responders. They're always the heroes. They go in when everybody's running out, and we forget that they're humans too, and they see things, and months later, they see the effects of this. So it's very important that our first responders are never forgotten in this process, also with the mental health and trauma healing.
Thank you for your leadership.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Ms. Jackson-Lee.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. 7 days ago, I held a gun summit hearing, and a young woman by the name of Ayanna Stewart gave us her story. At 7 years old, her mother, who had 3 children, she lost her first brother by gun violence. She couldn't comprehend. At 13 years old, her second brother was gunned down in the streets, and she lost him by gun violence. A mother who had 3 children, hoping for the best, lost 2 of her sons, her only sons, to gun violence. Your stories here today are powerful, and I ask these quick questions. Mr. Chief, I spent 2 years writing the Violence Against Women Act. Would you tell us what is the weapon of choice for domestic abusers who use weapons against their victim?
Well, of course, handguns are generally a weapon that is...
It is a gun.
It is
That's
a gun.
what I'm asking.
Yes.
It's a gun.
Yes.
And what is one of the most dangerous calls that police have to go to?
Yeah, domestic violence calls.
And in many instances, I won't put words in your mouth, are guns in the mix of that call?
Absolutely.
And so to save lives of women, guns in the hands of those who should not have them, that legislation would be important.
Extremely important tool for law enforcement.
I have legislation dealing with storage. Isn't it a simple thing to ask gun owners to store their guns? Would that be helpful if you were required to store your guns safely?
Yes, one of the challenges that we have in St. Louis is citizens who leave their guns in cars, they're broken into and stolen, and they end up on a legal market.
And the illegal market is the basis of a lot of gun violence. It's not the Second Amendment that we're attacking. Thank you. Doctor, would you just, again, I know we've asked you this, very briefly tell us, because who can fathom a 6-year-old being shot? But Sandy Hook was a room full with an AR, weapon of war, AR-15 or weapon of war utilized. What is it like for little ones of that age to be shot with an AR, with a weapon of war, an AR-15?
Thank you, Congresswoman. Well, you know, as I was describing earlier, anytime someone is shot with a weapon like an assault rifle, the tissue is simply pulverized. It's not just what the actual missile is hitting. So you can imagine you have a young 6-year-old like you're describing, right? There's only so much room there. You can imagine the destruction to the organs that we would have to deal with as trauma.
So do we need that weapon on the street?
I do not believe that we should have military-style weapons on the street.
Ariel, you gave a passionate description at our hearing of how you feel as a young woman in March for Our Lives, living in a world of guns, that you could die any moment. Would you tell us?
Yeah, so being a part of March for Our Lives, one, it's hard to fathom that the people that I consider my dearest and closest friends, I'm only friends with them because of death. I'm actually only sitting here because of death. I'm only a part of March for Our Lives because of death. Most of the people in my phone I know because of death. So that in itself is hard, to be thankful for the friends that you have, knowing that you only have them because of someone's trauma.
Thank you.
And then also just feeling like, especially with like the Odessa shooting in El Paso, that it's only a matter of time that I'm involved in a mass shooting. These things are getting closer and closer to home. So with things continuing the way that they were, it's statistically reasonable to say that I will be involved in a mass shooting, or someone that I know or love will be involved in a mass shooting.
Thank you.
Thank
Ms.
you.
Lowy, recognized for 4 minutes.
I want to join my colleagues in thanking all the panelists who represent our nation's broad support for gun law reform. Our country has mourned so many lives lost to gun violence, more than any other industrialized nation around the world, and that is because we just have too many guns, too few laws on the books to protect our communities. Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell is proud of not taking up bills passed out of the House, like common sense gun reforms. His self-proclaimed status as Grim Reaper is insulting irony to those who have buried loved ones who might still be with us had only Congress done more. Dr. Saccharin, your activism in gun violence prevention has elevated the need for gun violence research. As a trauma surgeon, inspired by those who treated you following a gunshot, you're absolutely right to push back on the NRA's attempt to keep doctors out of the discussion on gun laws and to loudly proclaim, "This is our lane." Efforts to study gun violence, to develop research-based prevention strategies, have been stifled for far too long. As chair of the House Appropriations Committee, I am very proud that the House passed health appropriations bills address the public health emergency of gun violence for the first time in more than 2 decades. Our bill includes $50 million for the CDC and NIH to support firearm injury and mortality prevention research. This funding recognizes that we must fund gun violence research. Just as we would fund any other public health crisis killing as many Americans. Dr. Saccharin, can you just tell us again clearly, why is it important for public health institutions such as the CDC and NIH to fund research on gun violence? And what has the lack of federal funding done to the field?
Well, thank you, Congresswoman, for your leadership on this issue. The funding of firearm injury prevention is critical. There has essentially been a moratorium on funding since the 90s. And the reality is we have to stop trying to focus on this by trying to fix human behavior. We know that's not cost effective. We have to develop a system where it's less likely to be injured. And we have to really develop a data-driven approach in order to help guide our policymakers in ensuring that we're making all the right decisions, similar to how we have funded other public health problems. And when you consider the epic proportion of this issue, you know, we're grateful for even the $50 million, but that's still a small amount considering the proportion of disease and the burden of disease. Thank you for your leadership.
Well, thank you, and thank you to the panel, and thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Ms. Kelly, you're recognized for 4 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank all of you for being here. Today is September 10th, and as of this morning, I represent the Chicagoland area in Chicago for the month of September. 70 have been shot and wounded, 15 shot and killed. The week 9/18, 7 shot and killed, and 19 shot and wounded. So that was last week. The total killed this year, 357. This is just in Chicago, and over 1,600 have been shot and wounded. My colleagues from New Jersey hit the nail on the head for us. While I am 110% behind background checks and everything we've already done, if we don't have national trafficking bills, there's no one around us. You know, we're the favorite pawn of the president about Chicago, but no one else around us, unlike New Jersey, Connecticut, New York, no one else around us has any kind of bills. Most of our crime guns do come from Indiana, they come from Wisconsin, they even come from Mississippi. Chief, I'm looking at you since you represented a metropolitan area. Just curious what you think about that.
You're exactly right. You're surrounded, Illinois is surrounded by states with weaker gun laws. Indiana, Missouri, borders, Illinois. There is a flow of guns that comes from Mississippi up to Illinois, and so with this patchwork, it's very difficult for cities to protect themselves and communities to protect themselves.
And since most of our crime guns are illegal, even with background checks, you know, the criminals aren't going through that, even though I think that background checks are the foundation. I also wanted to thank Moms Demand Action, Everytown, Giffords, Brady, Good Kids Mad City, for all of your advocacy. You are truly the wind beneath our wings, and I just hope and pray that you have a good group in Kentucky, if you're getting my drift, because since 2014, I shared this yesterday, 1,400 people have been shot and killed in Kentucky, and 56 were kids and teens. So we really need to hear from Kentucky. We have a rally on September 25th, and we hope that as many people as possible come at 1 o'clock on the west side of the Capitol. As great as our chairman is and all of our members are, we cannot do this without you. We cannot do this without you speaking up. And for those who have lost loved ones, thank you so much for your selflessness. I don't even know what else to say about it. I work with a lot of my moms and dads that have lost their kids, and I thank them all the time because you don't have to be out here, but you are. So thank you so very much, and I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Panetta, you're recognized for 4 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for your work on this very important issue, Speaker Pelosi, as well as all the witnesses. Thank you for your time and preparation for coming here today. Once again, my name is Jimmy Panetta. I represent the Central Coast of California. Within that falls Gilroy, California, that I'm proud to represent not only that town, but share it with Congresswoman Zoe Lofgren, who was here earlier today, but she had to leave to go to a markup in the Judiciary Committee on gun control legislation. Now, what you got to know about Gilroy is that they're very proud of their garlic, let me tell you. As an Italian, I can understand that. But Gilroy will always has been and always will be defined by their pride of that garlic. And let me tell you, it's no better demonstrated than in a 3-day festival called the Gilroy Garlic Festival, which on Sunday, July 28th, I was able to take my 13-year-old daughter to and experience that pride. Let me tell you, as we were there, I never, ever could have imagined what happened 2 hours after we left. In that, a young man who had purchased a gun, an assault weapon, in Nevada, and numerous rounds of ammunition, brought that assault weapon into California, sneaked it into the event, actually cut a hole in the fence, and sneaked that firearm into the event, and indiscriminately started shooting, in which he killed a 13-year-old, a 6-year-old, and a 25-year-old. Now, fortunately, the Gilroy police, who I actually saw there that day, engaged and subdued that shooter. Now, it was amazing to me that subsequent to that shooting, people came up to me in my district and asked, what have we been doing? What have we been doing? Now, I was fortunate enough to say, thanks to the leadership of Chairman Thompson, that we did our job and we passed H.R. 8 and H.R. 1112. But it's been 195 days since we passed that bill. And as you just heard from one of our witnesses, 15,000 deaths have occurred because of gunfire in the meantime. And clearly, I think we all know that's a failure of leadership is what it comes down to. Failure of leadership in the Senate, failure of leadership in the White House. And I believe that America is absolutely yearning for action on gun safety reform. Anything, something, and therefore we need to do everything we can when it comes to gun safety reform. I can tell you that Gilroy will always define itself by garlic. It will not define itself by the shooting that occurred at the Garlic Festival. And I can tell you, as members of Congress, we need to make sure that we don't define ourselves by the inaction of the Senate and the lack of leadership by this White House. A good friend of mine said something that's very true. Yes, thoughts and prayers are appropriate, but they are clearly insufficient. The only thoughts that we should have are for what we should do on gun safety reform. And the prayers that we will have is if we fail to do anything on gun safety reform. Now, that being said, Chief, I'd like to ask you, in regards to your experience in St. Louis, as well as your knowledge based on your time at the FBI National Academy, the Police Executive Research Forum, as well as the FBI National Executives Institute. Tell me about your experience in dealing with guns coming in from out of state and how that affects victims of firearm violence. In 15 seconds. 30 seconds, sir.
30 seconds.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Well, you know, it's difficult, as we spoke to control the flow of weapons into the community when you have particular laws in your state, but surrounding states have laws that are very lenient. And so, you know, individuals pick up on that and they know where they can get guns to bring them into your community. So it makes it very challenging for investigations and for law enforcement in the community.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. I just want to let everybody know this is the 15-minute warning. Remember, we have to be out of here at 1:45. Mr. Cox, you're recognized for 4 minutes.
Thank you so much, Chairman Thompson. Chief, would passage of H.R. 8 save lives of police officers and first responders?
I believe it absolutely it will.
Absolutely will. Thanks so much. And Mr. Bencomo, I'm a hunter just like you. And when you go out and shoot a pheasant, how many shells can you put in your gun?
Well, in our state, 2.
Right. In our state, it's 3. But you can't put a 100-round magazine in, all right?
No, sir.
And let me, I want to give a shout out to Moms Demand Action, Every Town for Gun Safety, March for Our Lives. You are the people that's going to get it done. As Lincoln said, with public sentiment is everything. With it, nothing can fail. Without it, nothing can succeed. You are on the front lines here, and I know that you're making a difference, and we will get this done. It was interesting. I checked, I just made sure, because I wanted to be sure when I walked into the Capitol this morning, I asked some of our Capitol Police and our security whether or not I could bring my firearm into the Capitol. And you know what the response was? Absolutely not. You can't bring it into this office. You can't bring it into Mitch McConnell's office. Why? All right? I'd like to ask him that question, and I would invite you to march down to his office and ask him that question. And if you need directions, I'll be glad to lead you there, all right? But the fact is that H.R. 8 was passed 195 days ago. Mitch McConnell, the Senate, has done nothing. Let's get it done. And so thank you all for being here today. I applaud you for all of your efforts on every side of the of this issue. And you know that our Congress is behind you. With that, I'll yield the balance of my time. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Mr. Price. You're recognized for 4 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to all of you. This has been a remarkable afternoon. You've all given testimony that combines deep emotion, passion, but also a lot of common sense and a lot of effective argument. We don't always have all those qualities combined in the testimony that we hear, but we have with you, and I hope this will move the needle in terms of what needs to happen 100 yards away, although it sometimes seems 100 miles away, in the U.S. Senate. It is hard to believe that these tragedies, one after the other, these lost lives, have not moved our colleagues to do what our most fundamental job is to do, and is to address public health, address public safety, address the public interest of the country we serve. I want to ask about one particular remedy. The mayor unfortunately had to leave. I wanted to ask her to address it, but I hope others of you can, and it has to do with one area where there seems to be a glimmer of light in terms of some possibility of bipartisan support, and that is the extreme risk protection orders. 12 states and D.C. have enacted laws that allow family or household members to petition a court to keep guns away from dangerous people. That's in addition to law enforcement officers. And then 3 states, in addition, including Florida, have given that authority to law enforcement officers. I come from a state where we don't have this, but we have plenty of gun violence. And one case in particular haunts me. 4 years ago, we had the tragic loss of life of 3 Muslim students and community members in a horrific hate crime, Chapel Hill, North Carolina. The man who murdered them was known by his neighbors to be a lot of trouble. He was angry. He often lashed out at people. He had an arsenal in his home. I suppose it's not guaranteed, but I keep thinking that an extreme risk protection order could have saved those lives. It could have allowed law enforcement to intervene at the signs of his threatening behavior. So I want to ask you whether you share that assessment. I mean, some of these states aren't deep blue states. There's some political, some possibility here. It seems that this might have a potential. Of course, all these measures we've discussed are important, but I want to know your assessment of that one in particular. And anything you have to say about places where this has been enacted and what the results have been.
Congressman Vic Bencomo from Colorado, we successfully last session passed ERPO in our state. And I'll tell you, you're absolutely right and spot on. For those states that don't have it, ERPO does save lives. The data is there. We know that it works. But however, we need a universal passing of that for at the federal level so that all states can also have an ERPO.
You know, we do have some tentative figures from Connecticut, I believe, where they've studied this and concluded that every 10 to 20 firearm removals, this is Connecticut and Indiana, have saved approximately 1 life, and that's usually through an averted suicide. Does that sound right to you?
Yeah, absolutely. And you know what, Congressman? If you could save 1 life in your state, you've done your job.
Chief, any?
Thank you very much. Mr. Deutsch, you're recognized for 4 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for calling this. Mr. Chairman, this has been a really good hearing. It's an excellent congressional hearing with thoughtful exchange of ideas, and that's typically what we want here. But I cannot help but sit here and be filled with rage. I am so grateful to Mayor Hunchowski for her leadership in Parkland and all that she's done. I'm so especially grateful that my friend Fred Guttenberg is here and for the leadership that he has shown. I want to follow up where Mr. Price left off. Chief Isom, if passing universal background checks and extreme risk protection orders could save the life of even one police officer, should we do it?
Absolutely.
Mr. Bencomo, if doing those common sense things would mean that one veteran's life would be spared because he couldn't have access to the gun that he could use to commit suicide, is that something we should do?
Absolutely.
Dr. Saccharin, if there was one person who was home with his family instead of lying on the operating table in your OR after being shot by a gun, isn't that worth doing?
Absolutely.
And Ariel, let me just tell you, let me back up for a second. So much of what we're doing here in Washington is because of people like you. It is the march. It is young people who cause some of the largest corporations in America to change their behavior with respect to guns. It is because of you that there is now a gun safety majority in the House of Representatives, and it is because of you that this battle continues to increase the pressure on Senator McConnell. But what you said today, in all of the time that we've spent in these battles together, I've never heard before, and it is as powerful, I think it powerfully sums up what's happening here. Like you, I and Fred and the folks at our table and a whole lot of people in this room and a lot of my colleagues, we have phones that are full of people we know because of death. That's not right. That's not the way it should be in our country. And so I try to remain cool and I try to be respectful of people's different opinions. But there can be no other opinion other than the one that believes that if we can save even one life, then by God, we've got to do it. And so I want to thank all of you for the work that you do. But Chief Isom, we shouldn't have a police officer have to worry about confronting someone with a weapon of war that shouldn't be on our street, who's carrying a high-capacity magazine that shouldn't be legal. And Mr. Bencomo, my God, there are so many good veterans like you, and I thank you for your service, who all around the country are looking out for their fellow veterans and helping to save their lives when they're in desperate need of help. And it shouldn't all be on your shoulders. Dr. Saccharin, we shouldn't have to rely on the incredible talents and commitment that you bring to the operating room to save lives of people who face gun violence. And Ms. Hobbs, it is because of you. It is because of you and young people around this country that we will succeed in making the reality change. I thank you for what all of you are doing. And it is not enough for us to talk about what McConnell must do. He must feel the pressure and outrage and anger of everyone in this room and in this country. And I yield back.
Thank you. Ms. Torres, you'll be recognized for the remainder of the time, and that will be our last member recognized. We have to be out of here at 1:45.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank all of you for being here, and not just the panel, but all the members in the audience. We have had a long conversation about the easy fixes. And even with the easy fixes that we could do right now and take up those issues right now, we see that only so few of us, members of Congress, are here present. The fact that there is not a single Republican that has had the courage to be here with us to talk about these easy fixes is a telling story. It is a telling story of the scale of justice that has been tipped on behalf of the NRA and against the people in our communities, against the hospitals, the doctors, the emergency rooms that have to care for the people that are dying in our streets, against the mayors that have to, like me, I was a mayor when 3-year-old Ethan Esparza was shot during a drive-by shooting in my home city of Pomona. He was celebrating his 3rd birthday. It was during my time representing my home city since 2000 that I have been witness to having to attend 4 funerals of police officers that have been murdered. Officer Steiner, a CHP officer, murdered on the steps of our courthouse. It was a gang initiation. He was murdered by a 16-year-old. It was Officer Daniel Frames, who came across a homeless person who he had come across many times before. This time he had a gun and he shot him. It was Pomona Police Officer Sean Diamond, who in the course of dealing with some hardcore motorcycle gang members, he was shot in the face with a sawed-off shotgun. And lastly, Gregory Casillas. That night that he was murdered was his last night on probation. Now, these are not mass shootings. These are everyday murders that are happening in our communities. 58% of Americans have experienced some type of gun violence. 58%. But yet we don't see 58% of Congress or the US Senate representing them. And that has to change. I want to yield back my time to the chairman for being such a wonderful person and allowing all of us to speak. Thank you once again for being here. I yield back.
Thank you very much. I want to thank all the panelists for being here, folks out in the audience. Thank my colleagues for being here. Sorry we have to cut it off, but we have to get out of the room. But please know that all the members who were here and the many who were at other hearings and couldn't be here are committed to carrying this through. The ball is in Mitch